Okay, it is 3 in the afternoon Swiss time, so let's go ahead and start. So hello Earthlings, and welcome to this UN World Data Forum session on the innovative use of social media for remote sensing and SDG monitoring. My name is Ingmar Weber, and I will be chairing this session. This session is organized with Emilio Zacchini at the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research, with Kieran Garimella, who is now at Rusket University, and with the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population, IUSSP. As most of you will know, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has thrown a wrench into the operation of traditional in-person data collection efforts. Most survey-based collections have had to pause to help limit the spread of the disease. At the same time, sudden and unexpected changes to how we live and work have made the need for timely data more pressing than ever. This situation of missing data in a fast-changing environment has increased the interest in using non-traditional data sources to complement existing data collection methods. In this session, we will hear about innovative ways to use one particular data source, social media. More than half of the world's population uses at least one form of social media, such as WhatsApp, Facebook, WeChat, or Twitter. In many countries, Facebook is seen as equivalent to the internet. And when a service such as WhatsApp goes down, even for a few hours, as happened yesterday, this sends ripples around the globe. Many use such services to stay connected with friends and family, or to share their opinions on topics ranging from food preference to voting choices. The vast data volume combined with the recency of information suggests that relevant information can be obtained by analyzing social media platforms. At the same time, the most vulnerable people are often exactly those not using social media. This creates a risk of amplifying the voices of the already well-connected. On top of that, there are ethical challenges concerning the data collection, as traditional consent mechanisms don't necessarily scale to millions of participants. In the rest of the session, we will hear from the experience of 5 distinguished speakers who have developed innovative ways in deriving insights from different forms of social media data. Each presenter will have 6 to 8 minutes for their remarks. After the round of presentations, we have time for questions at the end. I encourage the audience members to submit their questions using the chat function. Please indicate if your question is for a particular presenter or the whole panel. I will then select from the pool of submitted questions at the end. Please note that the session is being recorded, which I believe includes things in the public chat. I now invite Stefano Kresge to start sharing his screen while I introduce him. Stefano is a researcher at the Institute of Informatics and Telematics of the National Research Council in Pisa, Italy. His research sits at the intersection of web science and data science and encompasses topics such as social media mining and machine learning. He has won several awards, including a Sage Ocean Concept Grant, a PhD Thesis Award, and an IEEE Next Generation Data Scientist Award, and the Erkam Core Bayin Young Researcher Award. Stefano, the matrix is all yours.
Thank you, Ingmar. I'm going to present a work about a way for acquiring more and better data from social media, which I think fits this session pretty well. And I'm going to show you a couple of ways in which these techniques can be used for improving the amount and the quality of the data that we can get. But before jumping to the solution that I'm going to present, I would like to discuss a little bit about one problem that we have with social media data. We all know that social media data is intrinsically and naturally biased or skewed. For example, when we are interested in geographic information, geographic data, we know that we tend to receive more data from densely and highly populated areas. And instead, the rural areas tend to provide less data and less information for the tasks at hand. The same also goes for some topics, for example, that tend to attract more attention than others, or for some groups of people. So when we have to manage social media data and collect data for a certain objective, is there a way in which we can collect more data about underrepresented groups or locations or topics? And similarly, we also know that we tend to collect contrasting information, for example, for certain claims, in the case of misinformation, for example, or rumors that spread on social media. So is there a way in which we can, let's say, kind of automatically verify some information that we collect, or collect, let's say, information that corroborate some other information that we already have? Is there a way in which we can solve these issues? So for solving these issues, we must first talk about the ways in which we can actually collect data from social media. And there are mainly two ways in which we can do this. One is the opportunistic sensing, and the other is the participatory sensing. So when we talk about opportunistic sensing, we're talking about a system that transparently collects data from social media. So the users that contribute this data are not aware of the sensing system. They share data because they wanted to, because of their reasons, let's say, as they go through their daily activities. And the system transparently collects this data, for example, because it is related to a certain topic. In this case, the data is unstructured and heterogeneous because it is not targeted for the system. But we manage to have a very large and spontaneous user base because we don't have to motivate people into giving the data, right? They're sharing it anyway because they want it. While instead, in the orthogonal approach, the participatory one, people are aware of the sensing system and they willingly decide to share data with the system. So data here is structured and homogeneous because it is targeted for the system, but we have somehow to motivate people into giving us their data, okay? So the solution for the problem that I showed you before is based on a combination of these two sensing phases. So we have an opportunistic and a participatory sensing phase, and the combination of these two things results in what we call the hybrid sensing approach. Basically, this goes along three steps. So in the first step, we collect spontaneous user reports on a given topic. For example, a mass emergency for which we want to collect information. So spontaneous user messages on a given topic. Then we select a subset of users that are talking about the topic. And from those users, we ask for targeted additional information. Okay, so this is the opportunistic sensing phase. And the last one, when the user possibly answered to our questions, is the participatory sensing phase. Now, in the case of an emergency, for example, we can use this system to collect information in the aftermath of the emergency itself. So we begin with the opportunistic sensing. We select a subset of users for which we want to collect additional information, for example, witnesses of the emergency, so they know what's going on. We can ask targeted questions meeting the information needs of emergency personnel, and we collect possible answers to our questions with the participatory sensing phase, and then we can go on analyzing the data that we collected. So we deployed this system in practice on Twitter. Each of these, let's say, conversations that you see right here is a real conversation that took place on Twitter, which involved both users that were talking about an earthquake that they felt, and our system, which sent questions, and then users answered to our questions. So the topmost tweets are the spontaneous user tweets that we collected with the opportunistic approach. Then we have the targeted questions of our system. For example, we asked about geographic information related to the position of the user. And the answers are the detailed replies that we collected with the participatory sensing approach. And as you can see, users tend to give quite detailed answers to our questions. So analyzing a little bit the results of these studies that we carried out, we found that we could manage to obtain up to 30% answers rate. So 1 out of 3 questions, basically, that we sent received an answer from the users. And we can send thousands of questions in a quite limited amount of time. So this is a lot of data that we can collect. The vast majority of the answers that we collect arrives within 5 minutes from our questions, so pretty fast. So useful for time-sensitive applications. The vast majority of the answers that we receive is collaborative, meaning that the users who answers our questions, they actually provide the information that we asked for, which is good. And also about the content. For example, we managed to receive information about many locations for which we did not have any information before. So in the case that you want to produce, for example, a crisis map showing the most stricken locations in the aftermath of an emergency, this is very useful for filling, let's say, the sparsity of the maps about the rural areas, for example, for which we tend to have limited information. Also, the geographic information that we obtain is more fine-grained with respect to what we would obtain, let's say, only with the opportunistic sensing approach. So whether users tend to talk about countries or wide regions, in this case, we managed to obtain information about buildings or streets, so much higher quality information. Now, the same approach, of course, could be also used for monitoring other types of emergencies, let's say, as in the case of COVID-19. And for example, it has been used for nowcasting the spread of the disease. So people are using the, let's say, reports that users naturally share on social media in tasks such as infodemiology and infovariance to, let's say, augment the nowcasting of the pandemic. But also, it can be used to estimate the psychological conditions and the mood or the sentiment of the people in relation to the pandemic, and also to track misinformation, which we know has been an issue. So one final note before concluding my presentation is about the limitations and caveats of this approach. One of the main limitations is about scalability, because you need many social media accounts in order to send out many questions. And I mean, if you push your questions too much, the accounts might get banned. Of course, we have the chance to make deals with the platforms in order to overcome this limitation, but all the experiments that we did was with public Twitter APIs, so we did not do this. And of course, we had to be careful about this. The other caveat is, of course, about the reliability of the information that we have on social media, which we know is an issue. I think this concludes my presentation, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stefano. I think it was a good overview over different ways we can tap into Twitter data in particular. So next up, we have Riti Kashyap. So Riti is an associate professor of social demography at the University of Oxford, a professorial fellow of Nuffield College, and a co-leader of the Digital and Computational Demography strand at Oxford's Leverhulme Center for Demographic Science. The recent research has explored how technological change linked to digitalization affects human development processes and the role of novel digital data sources for understanding population phenomena, including tracking digital gender gaps. Riti, we are ready to zoom in on your work.
Thanks very much, Ingmar. Can I confirm that you can see my screen?
Yes.
And you only see my screen and not you, right? Great, excellent.
Correct.
Thank you for the introduction, and I'm very excited to be a part of this panel. And I'll be talking a bit about the research that I've been doing with lots of different collaborators, including Ingmar, on analyzing global gender gaps through social media advertising data. So before I go on to sort of describe the research and some of the findings from it, I want to start off by describing what I mean by social media advertising data. And that's really simply what's sort of shown on the screen. This is an example here from Facebook's Ads Manager, which allows us to ask how many users of a given set of characteristics, such as gender, location, device type, are users of this platform. So the internet economy is built on advertising, targeted advertising, and all social media platforms generally provide this information, which is essentially aggregated information about the audiences of their different platforms. So conceptually, we can think of this as a kind of digital census of these platforms. They're telling us, giving us information broken down by different characteristics of the user bases of these platforms. So here, for example, on Facebook's Ad Manager, I've asked in Nigeria, what's the audience, 18 plus, or men, and this sort of general query is giving me a potential reach of 15 million people. And that would be the sort of aggregate estimate that is of interest in the kind of analysis that I'll present also in the course of this presentation. So here, this is the query for men. And similarly, we can ask the same and say how many women. And then we see Nigeria has fewer Facebook users than who are women than men, and that's 9.1 million, right? And actually, at the core, this is exactly the kind of data that we use. We use these aggregated they're aggregated estimates of the audiences of different user platforms that social media advertising platforms provide, and we use these to generate gender gaps. And often we operationalize these gender gaps in terms of female to male ratios of the audiences of different platforms. So this is Facebook, but you can also do something very similar. Again, as I said, as a general principle, it applies to different platforms. So here is the ad platform for LinkedIn. And here, again, it gives you your estimated targeted audience size. This is male users in the Netherlands. But because LinkedIn is a very sort of specific platform geared to usually highly skilled professionals, you can also ask other information linked to company industry or fields of study or seniority and so on. So of course, the targeting facilities of different platforms might vary, but in general, the principle is very similar for all of them. So in our work, what we've tried to do is think a bit about the broader applications of social media advertising data for predicting Sustainable Development Goal 5, which is on gender equality indicators, by computing these kinds of gender gap metrics, which are often computed in terms of female to male ratios of audiences on these platforms, and use these gender gap indicators computed on these online platforms to predict other broader Sustainable Development Goal indicators. And there are two applications here in particular that I'll just show some examples of. One is internet and mobile access gender gaps, and this is also visible on our platform digitalgendergaps.org, where we use Facebook gender gaps to predict internet and mobile gender gaps across the world and provide monthly updates by requerying the Facebook social media marketing API. And also examples of this using LinkedIn's marketing data and looking at professional gender gaps with LinkedIn gender gaps. And the real advantage of these data sources is that they can potentially help expand geographical coverage, especially in areas where we might not have data available to be able to monitor these indicators. And also they can provide more timely data. And that's something that I'll also just briefly provide some examples of at the end. So as I was saying, there's clearly a data gap for many of these indicators, which motivates the reason to consider non-traditional alternative social media type data sources. So just as from Digital Gender Gaps, here you see gender gaps in internet use based on the best available surveys. Usually these are published by the ITU, but you see that if we wanted to compute a gender gap, the female to male ratio of internet use across the world, there are actually very few survey sources available. Many parts of the world, for example, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, we just don't have reasonably recent surveys available to be able to compute this indicator. But what we find is that actually Facebook gender gaps are highly correlated with internet gender gaps for the countries for which the surveys are available. So you can train a model to make this prediction based on the Facebook gender gap. And expand coverage of this SDG indicator on internet as well as mobile gender gaps. So you see that there are significant gender gaps disfavoring women in Sub-Saharan Africa as well as in South Asia in internet access. And that's also conceptually relevant because if we want to advance the data revolution forward and use social media data sources, then we need to understand who is online and who is not. And this is a first step in that direction. Similarly, to highlight the geographical resolution, with a lot of these data sources, you can really go, what I showed previously was at the country level, but in new work, we're trying to explore the subnational resolution and the fact that we could compute these indicators also at here global administrative level 2, GADM2 units. And this is for Africa, where we find that the coverage of Facebook data at GADM2 is considerably better than, for example, the demographic and health surveys. We don't have data here on Sudan, but we can definitely cover a lot of Sub-Saharan Africa as well as the whole of the African continent with the Facebook marketing data. Moving on to LinkedIn, what you see here is similar to the Facebook gender gap, a LinkedIn gender gap index computed again as a female to male ratio of LinkedIn users across the world. Again, we see that reds here correspond to gender gaps disfavoring women, whereas greens are parity. So male-female use is more balanced. And we see we can also create a similar LinkedIn gender gap index across the world. And we actually find that some of these gender gaps computed on LinkedIn are actually highly correlated also with official statistics from labor force surveys reported by the ILO, the International Labour Organization. But these correlations are generally better for more general professional gender gaps than managerial gender gaps linked to total management or senior management. And it's interesting to think why that is. One reason is likely to be that the LinkedIn user population for women is considerably younger. So there are a lot more young women who are represented or users of LinkedIn. And that is likely this age structural, the fact that younger women, also much younger in their careers, are represented is one of the reasons why some of the managerial gender gaps are likely not captured as well. But it is definitely a promising indicator, the LinkedIn Gender Gap Index, especially if just thinking about the professional gender gap correlations. It shows that LinkedIn gender gaps as observed online is a useful predictor for professional gender gaps. Another thing that we find when we do this kind of analysis is that places where there's greater levels of gender inequality, the gender gap indicators observed on online platforms like LinkedIn or Facebook actually do better at prediction than they do where gender equality is at parity or things are more equal. So when women are actually missing on LinkedIn or on Facebook, it's more predictive of the fact that they are not in the professional labor force altogether, or not online or using mobile phones. So in a sense, this is a very interesting finding about where our predictions go better. But even when we do find that predictions do better in some places than other, there are still some very interesting distinctive biases that we observe in our analysis. So here's an example of sort of this selection issue. So at levels, so here's essentially the predicted using LinkedIn, ILO professional gender gap, and the LinkedIn gender gap, and the ILO ground truth measures from the surveys. We find that at lower levels of in populations where women are much less likely to be online, so the gender gap in internet access is larger, we find actually that that LinkedIn over predicts gender equality. It gives us a more optimistic view of gender equality than is actually the case in the labor force. And that seems to be suggesting to us that women who are online are actually more selective in these settings. And just in the last part, I want to sort of describe some of the applications of these social media marketing APIs for potentially tracking changes that might be missed, as Ingmar was saying at the beginning, because of the lack of infrastructures during, say, a pandemic to track changes, social behavioral changes. So, for example, in the data that we collect on digitalgendergaps.org, we found that over the course of the initial lockdowns in Europe, there was a marked increase that was observed in the numbers of users. This is here women and this is here men, daily active users on Facebook. And this increase was generally larger for women than for men. One example, a really sharp example of this is really Italy, where we saw this huge increase in daily active users for women. This is here the blue line. And you can see because the ratio increases as well, it was really an increase for women rather than men in the daily active users. And this really coincides with the first lockdown just in the 11 regions in northern Italy before the national lockdown, which happened in the first week of March, when we see this boost. So that's sort of, an uptake of the use, especially amongst women in social media. There was a lot of speculation in the media. This was also driven likely by things like group calls and people relying on social media to keep in touch with other members of their family with social distancing rules in place. But we see this also in the marketing APIs. Similarly, in more recent events with the Taliban's takeover of Kabul, we see recent increases in daily active users on Facebook amongst adolescent women in Afghanistan here, 15 to 19-year-olds. We see significant increases again. Here, this is the ratio, women to men, the ratio is increasing, as well as the DAO, the daily active user count. Note, of course, these ratios are very different than the Italian context. They show that women are much less likely, as I was also showing in the map for South Asia. Afghani women in general are much less likely to be Facebook users, but we see increases. And this could be a form of social protest, as has also been reported in the media, women taking on and expressing themselves on social media to protest and also and overcome some of the barriers they might be facing in the offline world. But it is something that, again, you see in the data collected via social media marketing APIs. So just to conclude, what I've tried to show here is that the social media ad data provide valuable a valuable data source to potentially analyze gender gap indicators and understand gender and changes as they occur in real time. They can help to expand geographical coverage, provide finer spatial as well as temporal resolution for measuring SDG relevant indicators, SDG 5 relevant indicators. But I also want to emphasize that these data are best thought of as a good complement to survey data, but not a pure substitute. A lot of our work here, especially for trying to monitor SDG indicators, rely on some form of validation against ground truth to understand the biases better, to see what we can actually measure. And I think we need to think of them as a part of a widening data ecosystem where different sources of data provide different types of strengths, but also have their own unique weaknesses. So thank you very much. These are just some of the references that I've talked about, which I'm of course happy also for you to email me about. And I want to acknowledge that this work is really a really collaborative effort with a number of collaborators, including Ingmar, who's on the call today.
Great, thank you very much, Ruti, for sort of diving into an alternative form of social media data, so this advertising data. Our next presenter is Setya Pramana. Setya is an associate professor at the Politeknik Statistika STIS, Indonesia. He's also appointed as the Big Data Team Lead at BPS Statistics Indonesia. His current research focuses on the use of big data for public policy and official statistics, including satellite imagery for poverty mapping, marketplace data, big data for tourism management, social and online media analytics, web scraping, price statistics, and mobile positioning data for tourism and pandemic management. Setya, please take it away.
Okay, I'm muted. Thank you very much, Ingmar, for nice introductions. Hello, all of you. It's great to have all of you again for 1 year meeting. So as mentioned by previous speakers, that we can use different social media for different purposes. But for today's presentation, I will present some of our case to measure the impact of COVID pandemic in Indonesia, especially in some cases. Okay, so these are the outline of presentation. I will just briefly some cases that we are using, like how see the engagement of government in case of citizen and pandemic situations, and then the sentiment of pro and cons of contra of vaccination, because there's also some issues in the beginning of vaccination period and during the vaccination period. And also we use the Facebook Relative Index for poverty mapping, and we plan to combine that with different data sources, which actually one of the way to check for the result of the social media and check for the bias. Also we utilize TripAdvisor and information of Booking.com, especially for their reviews, to see the impact of pandemic on tourism, and then see how the citizen sees the government program on economic recovery and economic growth during the pandemic. So these are the data sources we use for these studies. It's from Twitter, Facebook, and also TripAdvisor, and also Booking.com, especially for their reviews. So first cases is how we try to see how the relationship between the government and the citizens in spreadness of the pandemic information management. We look at the first plot here that the number of tweets is getting increased in the beginning of pandemic, which is actually the beginning of March 2020, and then getting reduced on in December. Because of people are still, we have like new normal at that time, and then getting improved or increased when we have the 1st of January, because that's the first wave of our pandemic, and then it's getting increased sharply in the May and March, April of 2021, because we have the second wave, which actually much worse as compared to the first wave. That is showing how the tweets of from citizens, from the governments, from the official related to pandemics. And then if you look at the left, bottom left, that is the social network based on the three tweetings. So if you look at all the dots in the middle, actually that is the president's account, Jokowi, and also Ministry of Health, and also we have a task force that actually related to the focus on the pandemic management and also handling. So, and also the interesting fact that they are the center of the discussion of the management informations, and then it's spread by there is one like communities called Kawal COVID, actually, to provide more detail on more spread to the to the people, to citizens. And then we see that some of the number of retweeted basically based from the presidents, and followed by the online news, and also some of communities that are related to the COVID. The next case is with before the vaccination period, which actually at the end of 2020 and at the beginning of 2021, we see that how the people react with the plan of vaccinations. And then there are some positive and negative words, sentiment related to this vaccination program, but most of the positive is related to whether it's safety, and then some negative is their side effects and whether it's hoax or not, and then afraid with the impact, and some information that actually not that good. So for the positive, more on it will be free, and then it will be affordable, and it will be effective against the pandemic, the virus. And then we use also for during the vaccination period, because we have several type of vaccines. So we compare how the people are react with their situation. So whether they agree with that, and then how this different type of vaccine affect their body. So for example, Sinovac, mostly it's sleepy. They tend to be usually after 1 day of vaccination, they're going to have like a really sleepy day, and after that, hungry, fever, and etc. But for AstraZeneca and Moderna, they tend to have like fever in the beginning of the vaccination, and then after that, some dizzy and also some pain. But most these actually I check with the medical doctor. This is what actually we expect to see some side effect based on that type of vaccines. And also some topic modeling related to some vaccinations, mostly how the government performance on the vaccinations, and also the halal of the vaccine, because we are the largest Muslim country. So we most of the citizens concerned about the halal of the vaccinations, and also some citizens hope, and also some other clinical tests of the vaccines. And the third case is we use the newly produced statistics. We just get it for a couple of weeks ago or months ago. We get it, and then we try to use that for poverty mapping. So we have the Facebook have announced, or they open a relative wealth index for 2.5 square kilometers of the wealth index. So based on that, we have also for Java, that is for Java Island. So the higher the number, the higher the color means that the higher the wealth index. So we use that to compare also. We use that for this is a relative wealth index for one province, and then the left-hand side, and the right-hand side is the poverty based on official statistics. We try to check whether the numbers is more or less the same for this province and for other provinces or regions. So we see that tends to have similar pattern, and then this is the left is not a wealth, but actually more or less like poverty, right? So we reverse that from wealth to poverty, and then the numbers, the darker means that the latter the lighter means that more that is more poverty, and the darker is less poverty as compared to the rest of the area. And then we use also a number of reviews, the reviews from TripAdvisor and Booking.com to measure the impact on tourism industries. Left here is basically in the middle is the number of reviews based on their origins. So the good thing is from the Booking.com, we can have the origin of the reviewers, and then see that in the 2019 in Bali is one of favorite places for tourists. Is on Australians, they come more, but then 2020 is Indonesians. Actually, because of the tourism right now, because of the limitation of people comes to Indonesia, so now the tourism industry is actually revived by the domestic tourisms. And then we see that in the right plot, actually, that the length of stays in Bali, based on the numbers we can get from Booking.com, the reviews, and then we compare it with official numbers. Although the pattern, although the numbers is higher in the book for Booking.com, but then the pattern is more or less the same. And the two plot and the bottom is comparing the Google trend. We also see the Google trend, how people are searching for a hotel and also restaurant, for example. And so compare with the official room occupancy rate and also the TripAdvisor reviews. And so the right hand side is comparing the international tourism based on official and also information from Booking.com. We observe from these two are more or less the same pattern. But if you look at the right one, we have 1 year, 1 month lag, because after they come to the areas, usually they have 1 month to report to reviews in the Booking.com or in the TripAdvisors. And then this is how we obtain, we try also to get the information, how the citizens react with responding of economic growth. And then we see that there are some really higher number of people that posting, and then we can have the social network and who are mostly the lead of this topic, and then some are positive tweets, and then some are more negative. And then we, as BPS Statistic Indonesia, react that, and then we share the information on how we calculate the economic growth, so the people can understand fully how why this number is so high, for example. And then I think that's all for my presentations because it's for quick. So hopefully we have some feedback from all of you. But then what we are doing right now is actually based on social media. But then we compare, we also complement with other big data sources, for example, satellite imagery, and also marketplace data, and also from checking from the ground checking, and also we use the official numbers to confirm all the data we base on social media analytics. So we are not only using that data to have some decision, but we always compare and also combine with different type of big data sources. I think that's all for my presentation. Thank you very much for your attentions.
Yeah, thank you very much, CTO, also for introducing like yet another type of social media data. In this case, it was also sort of from travel sites. We continue with Catherine Hoffman-Pham. So Catherine is an AI researcher at UN Global Pulse, interested in how big data, machine learning, and technology can be used to address policy problems. Her research has studied the impact of ride-sharing platforms in urban settings, the use of AI to understand migrant movements, and the potential of new data sources to measure demographics in the developing world. In between academic degrees from NYU's Stern School of Business and Stanford University, she spent 4 years working on randomized controlled trials with innovation for poverty action. Over to you, Catherine. I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you for the introduction and for the invitation to participate today. So hopefully this presentation will complement sort of some of the work that's already been shown. But essentially, I want to talk about the use of Facebook as a tool, again, for remote sensing and SDG monitoring. So, you know, my research has sort of been motivated by the observation that traditional in-person surveys can be sort of time-consuming and expensive, but we do know that they are of very high quality. So if you imagine the census, for example, as a canonical case. However, you know, online surveys may be appealing because they're fast and affordable, but there's much less evidence on the quality of these online platforms and the data that we can collect on them. And in particular, we've noticed that researchers are increasingly using Facebook as a survey recruitment tool. So we see that there are about 2.7 billion monthly active users as of September 2020. So you have access to a pretty large part of the world population. And as Rudy has sort of demonstrated, the advertising platform allows for some very granular targeting. So, for example, people are looking at Polish migrants living abroad in a specific subset of countries. And this is all possible because of sophisticated capabilities that have been developed to serve ads, whether those ads be for a product or for a survey. We've also noticed that people have started using Facebook to do quota sampling. So once you can target people by age or gender, you can then try to create sort of representative sample to approximate national surveys. And so the question that motivated my research was whether the strategy could actually succeed in the global south. So together with my co-authors, we decided to look at two key case studies, one in Mexico and one in Kenya. So these are the ads that we've served on Facebook, encouraging people to participate in our surveys. And we essentially tried to copy the targeting strategy of two nationally representative surveys, the LAPOP survey in Latin America and the Afrobarometer in Kenya. So targeting people in Mexico by age, by gender, and by their location, and then in Kenya by gender and by location. And so, at the high level, we feel encouraged that Facebook can be used to diversify audiences, particularly beyond the type of audience that you might collect with surveys run by Mechanical Turk or by undergraduate lab samples at a university. It's relatively cheap to recruit people in real time. So we found, for example, targeting people in Nairobi could be done with ad costs as low as 5 cents per person. And usually within 2 or 3 days, you can have already a considerable sample size of people that have been recruited into your survey. And the targeting capabilities offered by the platform, as I said, are really rich. So in Mexico, you're able to target at the municipality level, which is shown on the left. And then in Kenya, we were actually able to target by GPS coordinates and a radius around those coordinates. So we were actually able to mimic the Afrobarometer sampling strategy at a very granular level. However, we found that this really comes at a cost. So we found some strata, some groups of people simply could not be reached. We tried to advertise to them and we couldn't garner any respondents in that category. We also found that for certain populations, survey costs could get quite high. So we were paying up to $22 per person to advertise a survey, per person recruited into the survey to do the ads. We also found that the accuracy of targeting via Facebook is mixed. So for example, Facebook is relatively accurate on the dimension of gender, but we see more variation in terms of the targeting by location, by education, or by age. And finally, we found, as you would expect, Facebook has the Facebook platform is a biased selection from the entire national population. But we also found that people we could recruit with our surveys is biased relative to the population of people on Facebook as a whole. So generally, we're tending to recruit younger and more educated people. So that, by doing the surveying, we're getting an even more biased sample than if we were just to look at the Facebook population altogether. And I wanted to just show, as an illustrative example, a set of questions that we asked in Kenya about political attitudes and engagement. And sort of what's kind of interesting here is when we're comparing Facebook example to the Afrobarometer, we can see that people on Facebook are more likely to be engaged. So they say they're more likely to protest, to contact the government, or to vote, but they're less likely actually to report that they're partisan and equally likely to approve of the president or feel free to speak. And so the reason why I just wanted to draw attention to this graphic is that, there are clearly biases or differences between these two samples, but it's not entirely obvious, right? They're not entirely consistent. And so, the importance of benchmarking against these national samples is really sort of evident here. So in light of the COVID pandemic, I guess I would argue that Facebook has sort of taken on, even greater relevance. In particular, it's an important source of real-time and remote data on the real world. We have this, for example, this paper from Grow that in 2020 that already were able to start gathering data on people's behavior and contact by March of 2020. We also see, on the other hand, that Facebook, rather than being a way to measure behavior in the real world, is actually a setting itself that we would want to study for the spread of viral misinformation. And so I think we've seen already sort of a really interesting variety of uses of the platform. So for example, we can see that there's already symptom tracking surveys. This global COVID trends and impact survey is collecting about 500,000 responses per day of self-reported symptoms around the world. We've also seen the opportunity to use this for crowdsourcing. So I really like this paper by Vicalio et al. And they were able to actually ask people to furnish messages to inspire their fellow nationals to obey social distancing. So, there's an example of someone saying that staying away from each other is an act of love. This is something that, message that I might not come up with as a policymaker, as an academic, but that people can supply, and you can sort of see what type of messages they find appealing, and test some of those alternatives. And then the final sort of option, I think that is a really rich ground for further research, is the opportunity to test interventions. So I've pulled 2 examples of campaigns encouraging people to stop and think about what they're sharing before they forward misinformation. But you can imagine, if you even just look at these two examples, there's very different sort of graphics, messaging strategy, and these can sort of be tested using Facebook as a setting, right? So you can actually run these ads and see which ones are generating greater engagement, who's clicking more, and sort of, are they popular among different demographics. So I'll conclude by saying that, I think the pandemic has highlighted what is essentially a continuous demand for real-time information, whether we want to monitor the SDGs, whether we're interested in the impact of financial crisis. There's sort of a constant need in different settings for real-time information that can be supplied by an online platform. And so the question for me is not really whether to use social media or whether social media is biased, but really how do we use it? How what settings is it effective, and how can we overcome any shortcomings or limitations? And then I think, sort of the next generation is really, we focus a lot on information gathering, on survey data collection, but the next step is really thinking about intervention. So how can we spread messages in an effective way or encourage behavior change for the public good? And so hopefully this is, an area that will continue to sort of develop as we live out the pandemic and try to gather more information on what we can do to fight it. So for now, I'll try to keep it quick, but thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, thank you very much, Catherine. It's nicely complemented both Stefano's presentation in terms of sort of using sort of active reaching out, as well as sort of Riti's presentation in terms of using the Facebook advertising platform. So now, last but not least, we'll hear from Lisa Singh. Lisa is a professor in the Department of Computer Science and a research professor in the Massive Data Institute at Georgetown University. She has co-authored over 80 peer-reviewed publications, as well as the book Words That Matter: How News and Social Media Shaped the 2016 Presidential Election. The research projects, for which she has received external funding from many entities, include developing methods to better understand forced movement due to conflict and identifying poor quality information such as misinformation on social media. Lisa, the floor and virtual background, if you like, is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you all hear me?
Yes, very well.
Excellent. Okay, so thank you for the opportunity to give a quick overview of some of the research that's taking place in the MAD project at Georgetown. That's our new name. And this is a collaboration with people not only at Georgetown, but across Canada and Europe as well. So I want to just quickly talk about the task. And then I really want to focus on this misinformation angle that we were just talking about a moment ago. So at a high level, sorry, my slide, there we go. At a high level, our prediction task is determine when, where, and how many people will move from one location to another. And as everybody has already alluded to, if we could survey the world, that would solve a lot of our problems, but we can't. So how do we use these new forms of data, particularly social media data, organic newspaper data, and other types of data with traditional administrative and survey data to improve early warning of forced migration? And if we look at this model, one of the first things we thought about was, what are the drivers of movement? Because drivers of movement vary all across the world, how do we pull them together in a meaningful way? It can be very complex and time-consuming to identify the drivers all over the world and then build models for this. So social scientists on our team worked to develop an adaptable decision model that I'm showing here, and incorporates different theories of causal factors of why people move. But it allows us to use a single model to get at the drivers of movement. So we have macro, micro, intervening variables, and we have this menacing context that captures different types of insecurities. And what this model allows us to do is easily translate factors into variables, into mathematical models that can be used to highlight different types of movement. And so, sorry, I'm having a hard time with my mouse today for some reason. I apologize. Okay, so we take these factors and we map them to variables. And this is one of the key steps that takes a little bit of effort. We have 4 types of variables. We have these traditional standard design statistical variables that are used already in migration. And then we have 3 types of big data variables, with the idea that we should collect these from a lot of different sources, not just one social media source. We have perception, which gets at sentiment, emotion, and stance. We have buzz variables, which looks at volume of conversation about each of these different factors and drivers. How does that volume change through time? In one conflict, it might be environmental drivers and factors and variables that change through time. In another, it might be disease or economic. And then we look at event variables. What are the different types of events that are occurring and how are those influencing those dynamics? And it's worth mentioning that there are a lot of lagging types of variables that are very useful for movement, such as death rate. But when we can use online conversation, we want to see whether or not we can use it as a proxy for some of those lagging variables that so that we can do this in an early warning type of setting. And I think the pandemic has also shown the importance of doing this in a setting that is more prospective. So as we look at different regions of the world, we're trying to understand this relationship between different big data variables, traditional movement variables, and how these variables influence an individual's perceived level of threat or insecurity, which then leads to their likelihood of moving. We've conducted a number of different case studies using big data. We're currently focusing on Iraq and Venezuela, but we've developed this large-scale pipeline that allows us to get from these raw organic data sources and traditional sources and traditional design variables to our modeling efforts. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about how to quantify different variables that we have and how to map them to those factors that I was just showing you. And as we've been working on this, one of the things we've really noticed is that misinformation is becoming a driver of movement in certain ways. And so because we were less familiar with this in the context of movement, and because we're very interested in continuing to get information, content-related information from different online sources, we wanted to start thinking about misinformation and movement and what the themes are and how these themes vary spatially. And I can't go through too much here because I just want to keep this very brief and short. But as a small study, we looked at Spanish conversation on Twitter. We used a decahose sample of 10% of the daily tweets in Spanish from August 2020 to March 2021. And we focused on 2 different things. We focused on COVID-related misinformation and also misinformation related to migration. So we built out streams that used keywords that would highlight that the conversations were about those. And after we did different pre-processing, we identified specific phrases that were associated and made a hand-curated list of these phrases and then augmented those with semi-automated techniques to build these kind of misinformation themes that we could track through time. Ultimately, we found during this time period about 275,000 Spanish misinformation tweets within our migration stream. And just to give you a brief notion of the types of information that was discussed, the majority of them talked about how migrants were invaders and attackers and there was a security and safety threat. Far less talked about them as an economic threat or a health threat, which was interesting given that we're also in the times of COVID, we would have thought the health threat might have been bigger. And if we look at that also in the context of spatially, seeing where this conversation was taking place, we focused in on South America and 6 particular countries where there's been migration from Venezuela to neighboring countries. And what we see actually is that misinformation is specific to certain locations And we also see that those locations are not locations where people have chosen to move as much as other locations. And this was a very interesting finding because it was counterintuitive, but it reminds us that misinformation is a push and a pull factor, right? So it may be the case that they're trying to deter movement to certain places as opposed to trying to pull people towards there. I'm sorry, I'm in a room that auto lights go out if I don't move. The last thing I wanted to mention real quick is we think it's very hard to compute these types of metrics. And so given the complexity involved in that, when we're using different types of organic data, we've developed a data portal mechanism to share our variables, but also to allow others to construct variables with these data sources. If you have an interest in that, we would love to talk to you more, but we have portals related to forced migration and COVID, where we take organic data sources and do word frequency, sentiment analysis, topic analysis, and different types of sampling to allow researchers to have the opportunity to go through the data in a meaningful way. I'm going to stop there. We have a great team, lots of funding. We're very fortunate. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lisa, and also the other presenters for sharing your thoughts. So we have about 5 minutes for questions. So I'd again like to encourage the audience to ask questions using the chat function, and I'll sort of give priority to questions from the audience. But just while we wait, sort of also in the meantime, let me kick off the Q&A with a question from myself. And that relates to the ephemeral nature of social media platforms. So people who are old enough might remember sort of MySpace, sort of a site, which in the mid-2000s was the biggest social media site on the planet. But of course, then it was dethroned by Facebook, right? And so maybe in a parallel universe, we would have started setting up, using MySpace data for official statistics and some NSO sort of a site. And so, how do we deal with this sort of ever-changing nature of things sort of coming up? Maybe the next big thing is the metaverse, or it's TikTok, or sort of also, right? Like sort of also. So I mean, in your sort of methods, are there certain things that you think that will persist, over the next decades, even as the landscape changes, or does it not really matter? Because maybe well, it's all about helping people today, and so who cares if the method breaks down 2 years down the line? Yeah, maybe we can go in reverse order, but again, if you have thoughts on the topic, so maybe I'll start with you, Lisa, if you'd like to chime in any thoughts on the sort of topic of changing landscape of platforms.
Yeah, so I think we should anticipate that they will change and try to build methods and models that are a little robust to those changes. I mean, we already are seeing how prevalent TikTok is becoming. How many of us can take our methods and now move to TikTok and try to find the same information with this new population? Because social media has such targeted populations, Facebook is the exception, but generally you only have subsets of the population. I think it's really important that we never forget that we shouldn't just focus in on one, that we need to actually know that they're coming and going. They're also using different algorithms. They're also going to give us different amounts of data. So that variability that's going to continue to be in this space, we have to account for.
Catherine, if you have any.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that I think we can, the platforms will change, but we can focus on these sort of high-level questions like the, bias, which will sort of pervade any sort of platform that we use. I guess the other point I would make is that if we think about the alternative, which is sort of traditional surveys, those have setup costs too, right? So if you think about running, surveys in different countries, you need to develop, recruit respondents and do a census of the people on the ground. So in some sense, it's hard to learn how to use the Facebook platform to launch survey ads, but on the flip side, you can then reach people in 30 different countries, in a matter of minutes, whereas that would be much harder to do if you were in the sort of the analog version of that.
Sitya?
Yes, okay, that's very good question. That's why if we want to use the big data, especially social media, to be an official, should be sustained, right? So I have to make sure the data sustained within some period. That's why we don't use this social media approach that we are working right now as official. but we use that as complementary. So we have official, and then we complement that with this information, because usually the official is only some period, right? So in between we can add this information, and then we can make it some like proxy or leading indicator based on this information. But then again, we don't use that official because some limitation or that. But then we use this as a complement, also as a leading indicative, and also we use this as we combine that with different data, like mobile positioning data, which actually will be, I guess, will be more sustained as compared with other data sources, and satellite imagery. So we in this project, especially for poverty mapping, also socioeconomic indicators, we combine those in data sources into some modeling techniques, and then we compare that with official numbers. That's all from me.
Thanks. Ritti, any brief comments?
Yeah, I agree with everyone's ideas here about multi-platforms, using multiple platforms, checking bias, using these in a complementary data ecosystem, as I was saying. I think one point also to bear in mind is that, social media, I think it's very important, if we're going to use social media as a lens for analysis, that we also understand the behavioral and psychological as well as demographic factors that result in certain platforms being used by some people, right? So sort of having better theories of also why people use certain technologies and how they use them can also help us make better use of them. So I think that would be my call for more theory-driven research for understanding the impacts and use of technologies as well.
Thanks. Stefano, last but not least, closing remarks.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I spent a lot of time working on data collection, so not only analysis, but especially collection from social media. And I'm not going to lie to the audience. I think it requires a great deal of effort to follow the evolution of these technologies. And this doesn't only concern some social media disappearing or falling from grace or another one emerging, but we must also consider the changes within a social media through time. We've seen with Twitter APIs recently, or we were talking about misinformation, we've seen interventions being deployed for kind of contrasting misinformation, like warning label being applied to certain posts and stuff. So we might, I mean, we want to be able to catch these nuances while we collect data and of course analyze this data. And this requires a great deal of effort for this. So we must kind of be able to provide that effort, I think, through time. And I would also like to highlight that the need for multi-platform approaches and studies. These are not enough. I mean, what we're doing right now is typically confined the C-load to a specific social media because, I mean, we have difficulties in doing this, but we should try to do a bit more to this regard, in my opinion, and try to focus more on multi-platform approaches, multi-platform studies. So that's all from me.
Great. Thank you, Masha. Unfortunately, we're out of time, already 2 minutes over time. So thank you again, everybody, for contributing. Thank you, everybody in the audience, for attending. If you do have additional questions for the panelists, I'd encourage you to connect maybe through the WOVA conferencing platform, sort of, or so, or through social media, of course. Yeah, thank you again for joining. Stay healthy and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.